Friends, very good evening to all of you. I welcome you all to a important CP meeting as well as an memorial lecture, 13th V. Shankar Aiyar Memorial Lecture, uh, which is going to be addressed by our beloved speaker, Dr. Arvind Subramanian. Before we take things forward, I request everybody to raise for ICA Motors. Thank you, all of you. Our respected chief guest and our speaker today, Dr. Arvind Subramanian ji, former Chief Economic Advisor, Government of India, and Professor of Ashoka University, and Director, Ashoka Center for Economic Policy, and Non-Resident Senior Fellow, Peterson Institute of International Economics. Guest of honor, Sri Manish Shankar Aiyar ji, who could not join because of his health. Former Union Minister for Panchayat Raj and Development of the Northeastern Region, members of the Central Council, my colleagues in the Regional Council, family members of Shri V. Shankar Aiyar ji, partners of V. Shankar Aiyar and Company, colleagues in the profession, and other distinguished invitees. It is most gratifying for me to be part of this prestigious program and for performing the pleasant and privileged duty of offering welcome address and for extending a warm and hearty welcome to the dignitaries and acclaimed personalities, Dr. Arvind Subramanian ji. All are, including our members of elite profession and other participants on behalf of SARC and on my personal behalf. It would have been great and heartwarming for me to have shared the dice along with these dignitaries had this program not been through the virtual mode. But it's due to the pandemic, which we all are aware that we are not able to do that. Nevertheless, I am beholden to perform this assignment of extending a warm and hearty welcome to all with a great delight. This evening, the Southern India Regional Council of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India is conducting its 13th V. Shankar Aiyar Memorial Lecture in memory and recognition of the contribution by C.A. V. Shankar Aiyar, founder of V. Shankar Aiyar and Co. Chartered Accountants, who left an indelible mark in our profession and to the nation through his contribution. The topic of the lecture under the series of the Shankar Aiyar Memorial Lecture today is on India's inward turn, causes and consequences. Selected by our chief guest, Dr. Arvind Subramanian, speaks for itself. The importance of our chief guest attaches to the growth of our economy and in sharing our thoughts how India should approach the market economy, especially during the pandemic scenario. Sir, your contribution in this economic field of our country is immense and impressive with your scholarly and rich experience, and also as the former Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India. With a blend of analytical and foresighted thoughts and approach you possess on the past, present, and the future of our economy, with challenges ahead, both in the Indian and globalized context. You have carved a niche for your acumen, not only in India, but across the globe, having been associated with several world bodies and articulating your thoughts through various mediums by addressing in innumerable economic forums, including authoring so many books. The books which I may like to mention some is India's Turn, Understanding the Economic Transformation, Eclipse, Living in the Shadow of China's Economic Dominance, and Who Needs to Open the Capital Account, and your presentation in the various organs as well. Sir, on behalf of the SARC and on behalf of all the participants, I offer our warm and heartiest thanks and gratitude to you for sparing your precious time to be amongst us, and we cherish your gracious presence for having accepted to deliver the 13th edition of the V. Shankar Aiyar Memorial Lecture. We are eagerly looking forward to your perceptive analysis and vision for the future on the subject of today. SARC also owes its gratitude to Sri Manishankar Aiyar ji, former Union Minister for Panchayat Raj and Development of the Northern Eastern Region, and the eldest son of late V. Shankar Aiyar, and also the creator of this memorial lecture, for honoring us with his gracious presence. In fact, he could not be present due to his illness, but we are looking forward to see that you come and be amidst us on some other occasion. And he has played a very supportive role to see that this program is happening year on year since its inception 2008. We fondly recall you are delivering the inaugural lecture of the first one, which happened on 9th May 2008 on the subject of Panchayati Raj Inclusion Growth through Inclusive Governance at our SARC premises. On behalf of SARC and the audience present here, we offer a warm and hearty thanks to all the value addition you have been making to our institute through this series of the memorial lectures. I also extend my hearty and warm welcome to the Central and Regional Council members of our region to this program. I also acknowledge the august presence of family members of V. Shankar Aiyar, our professional fraternity, and other distinguished invitees who are participating through the virtual mode and for making this occasion very special and memorable. Dear participants, let me record here that our respected Central Council member, Present Council member, C. Rajendra Kumar was instrumental in the institution of this V. Shankar Aiyar Memorial Lecture during his tenure as chairman of SARC in the year 2008. Since then, SARC has been conducting the memorial lecture year on year with leading luminaries from different walks of life in the country, delivering the prestigious memorial lecture over the last 12 years. With the gracious presence of our chief guest, Dr. Arvind Subramanian ji, today in our midst, SARC has added one more highly acclaimed personality in the host of dignitaries delivering the memorial lecture in the honor of C.A.V. Shankar Aiyar. SARC profusely expresses its hearty thanks to our guest of honor, Sri Manishankar Aiyar, who has been participating in all the memorial lectures and for constant support in organizing this program since the beginning. Probably this is the only program that is not present with us physically. Before I conclude, let me also have the opportunity to extend our warm welcome on behalf of SARC for the ensuing 52nd Regional Conference of SARC, which is going to be held between December 10 and 13, 2020 for 4 days, the same 12 hours of CP. The conference is very unique as it is for the first time in the history of SARC. It is going to be held in the virtual mode, and we as SARC assure you that SARC will try to ensure that it matches the magnificence of the regular regional conferences held in the past. I also take this opportunity to extend our invitation to you to be part of that unique program, and also request you to pass on the information among our other professional colleagues. The detailed information about the conferences will be disseminated to you through SARC newsletter, SMS, and email, and I'm very sure that your participation will be fruitful and purposeful to provide an enlightening 4 days of knowledge accumulation. The registration for the conference has opened on 4th November 2020, and I request members to register and avail the early bird incentive which we have given till 25th of November 2020. With these references, I once again take this opportunity to extend to all of you our warm, cordial, and hearty welcome to the 13th edition of V. Shankar Aiyar Memorial Lecture. On this occasion, I join with my colleagues in the Regional Council to greet all of you a very happy Deepavali and other festivities also ahead. Thank you very much. So before we proceed, we proceed, I'll request Dr. Yamini Aiyar ji to give her special address.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Jain, Honorable Chairman, Dr. Murthy, Honorable Secretary, Mr. Raja Srinivasan, Dr. Arvind Subramaniam, for being here today. I am a poor substitute for the real host, my father, Mr. SANKAR AIYAR, who unfortunately can't be here to personally welcome Dr. Arvind Subramaniam and thank everyone for being here today for the memorial lecture. But his illness has not prevented him from making sure that he's in the audience and listening. This is an event that is very, very dear to his heart, and I know that he was particularly excited. Months ago, he told me that Arvind has agreed to give the memorial lecture, and he was very privileged, excited, and pleased to have this opportunity. So Arvind, on behalf of my father, I wanted to say a very special thanks to you for agreeing to do this for us. It's a special moment for us as a family. To have the opportunity to have this platform to remember our grandfather. But what makes it even more special is to have someone like you who's been a friend, mentor, somebody that we have all, and me personally, learned from to be here on this occasion to deliver this lecture. So thank you very much. I hope that we can actually have you physically in Chennai one of these days for this lecture all over again. Webinars are no substitute for real interactions. I did, just before I hand it over to Arvind, want to say a few words about my grandfather. I, of course, unfortunately never knew him. But for those of you who know my father and who've had the opportunity to interact with him, you will know this, that he has this unending ability of storytelling and going down memory lane and regaling you with stories of his childhood, of his growing up years, and much as his children, we often would roll our eyes at those stories. What made them particularly special is that through these stories, he was able to keep the memory of our grandfather alive for us, make him a real person, and enable us to get to know what an incredible human being he was, and what an incredible life he led. So much so that every once in a while we look at ourselves and feel the privilege of our grandfather and what he had achieved in the short time that he was here. So for us, these lectures are particularly special because it gives us the opportunity to remember him, remember what he stood for, remember his work, but most importantly also remember the institutions that he built through his life's work. And this is something that across, as a participant in the process of institution building in India, in my own small way, I have a sense of the complexity of building legacy institutions that are long-term legacies. Which both bring in talent, hone talent, nurture the next generation of talent, and are able to endure the change and reimagine themselves as time progresses. And it is quite amazing. I feel a really deep sense of pride whenever we talk about chartered accountants companies as India globalized. I know today we are going to be talking about our inward turn, but there was a moment there when we had when we at least aspired to be outward looking, and multinational companies and the big four, the big five international chartered accountancy companies came into India as well. And yet VSA remains a household name. We all shudder at the thought of our auditors. All of you are rather scary individuals. Yet you were able to hold on and hold on to all of us. And it is a real sense of pride that, PWC, KPMG, all these acronyms get thrown at you, but there is, SANKAR AIYAR is always spoken of with a sense of integrity, a sense of commitment, learned a sense of the really strong honesty and credibility value systems that I hope I can bring into the institutions that I'm trying to build, strengthen, and hope that they contribute to India going forward. So he was a man that really, the values he stood for, all that my father has told us about him, we have seen in how my father has conducted his life. And we have learned from our great-grandfather how to take these values in your individual life and also place them in institutions that can make a contribution to this country. And for that, I'm very, very proud. He also was a great believer, unlike my atheist father and his brothers. And he founded the Ganeshji Mandir in Delhi near the Hanuman temple, which my Sardarni mother introduced us to. This was one part of my grandfather's life and memories that I don't recall. Maybe my father occasionally mentioned it, but I don't recall as much. But it was my mother who made his place of worship a very central anchor for our lives. Whether you believe or not, the ability to have a space that gives you a sense of warmth, comfort, and a place of peace and prayer that gives you strength is a very, very important anchor for our lives as a family, and that was a really important personal gift that our grandfather left behind for us. And in these times in India, it feels particularly special that it was my Sardar mother that brought this form of worship and this form of understanding the complexity of what is India into our lives and made us, I think, truly Indian. So with that, again, thanks all of you for giving my family and me this opportunity to celebrate my grandfather, to celebrate the life he had, to keep him alive for us. And hopefully enable us to make a small contribution to the many legacies that he left behind. He certainly ensured that some of my siblings can do 1 + 1, but I can assure you that neither my father nor I were particularly good at the many skills and talents that he had. But I hope that we can at least live up to the values that he held dear and the legacy that he left behind. I'd now like to welcome Dr. Arvind Subramaniam to deliver the lecture. Thank you once again, Arvind, for making the time to be with us. It really is special. Over to you.
Thank you, Yamini ji. I remember the 12th standard saying on companies that people may come and go, but companies will go on forever. So likewise, however people go, their memories and what they did will kind of remain with us. And thanks for sharing all the the memories which you had of this great person for letting us know. It is under whose memory we are all meeting today. So thank you so much. And Abhishek, I request you to introduce our beloved speaker, and then we'll request him to address.
Thank you, Chairman. A very warm good evening to all the participants who joined in today. Good evening to the dynamic chairman of SIRC, C.A. Dungachan Jain, organizer, and the memorial lecture being held on behalf of Mr. SANKAR AIYAR. We have Dr. Yamini Aiyer, who's representing the family, C.A. Raja Venkatraman Srinivasan sir, and of course, our star speaker of the day, Dr. Arvind Subramanian. Now, I would be remiss, even though Dr. Yamini ma'am has given her address, I would be remiss if I just simply address her as the granddaughter of the memorial lecture, or the daughter of SANKAR AIYAR. So Manish SANKAR AIYAR, she is someone of her own independent caliber who's achieved a lot. She's the president and chief executive of the Center for Policy Research, the CPR. In fact, she was studied in the University of Cambridge. She was in the London School of Economics. She worked in the World Bank and the Ford Foundation. So she has a lot of credibility behind her. So I don't want to simply say thank you for joining us as the daughter of Mr. Manish SANKAR AIYAR, but also for giving such a wonderful address as you have shared, lovely memories that even shaped your grandfather for us as well, even though for you as well, you said that you've never met him, but you've given a very, very lovely picture, a rosy picture, and a sort of a vivid memory about him that we can also cherish. Now I have the privilege of introducing our star speaker for the day, Dr. Arvind Subramaniam. He's a person who needs no introduction, but out of formality, we definitely have to introduce him and to appreciate the sort of achievements that he has done. Dr. Arvind Subramaniam is a professor currently at Ashoka University, and he was also previously a visiting professor at the Harvard Kennedy School. And as we all know, he was chief economic advisor to the government of India between 2014 and 2018. He has also been the Dennis Weatherstone Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute of International Economics and Senior Fellow at the Center for Global Development. He's worked at the research department of the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the GATT during the Uruguay round of trade negotiations, and in fact taught at the School of Advanced International Studies at the Johns Hopkins University. Foreign Policy magazine named him as one of the world's top 100 global thinkers in 2011. And in fact, India Today magazine named him as one of the top 30 masters of the mind in India for more than 30 years. His award-winning book, Eclipse: Living in the Shadow of China's Economic Dominance, was published in 2011 and has printed more than 130,000 copies worldwide, including in 4 languages. His latest best-selling book that I'm sure many chartered accountants here have read, reflecting on his time in India, Off Council, The Challenges, the Modi-Jaitley Economy, was published in 2018 and is widely regarded as an excellent read. As Chief Economic Advisor, he oversaw the publication of the Annual Economic Survey of India, which became a widely read document on the Indian economic policy and development. In fact, I must say, his survey in 2018 has had more than 20 million views from more than 119 countries in the very first year of publication. Among the major ideas and policies that he has been a very critical driver of, he initiated and helped implement the GST, which has been a game changer for the entire economy and specifically chartered accountants professionally as well. His attempts to tackle the twin balance sheet challenge, creating the financial and digital platform connectivity, the JAM Trinity, that is the Jan Dhan, the Aadhaar, and the mobile connectivity. This is called the JAM Trinity. He was a very key component of it, and the universal basic income, the proponent of that as well. His online course on the Indian economy is widely accessed, and in fact, at the end of his term as Chief Economic Advisor, he had a special thank you note, which was shared by the then Honorable Finance Minister, late Arun Jaitley ji, who wrote a Facebook post which went into several paragraphs, and it was quite emotional, acknowledging the contribution of Dr. Arvind Subramanian. He's written various articles and in the research documents on India, growth and trade development, institutions, climate change, intellectual property, and much more. He has published widely in academic and other journals as well, and ranked as one of the world's top 1% of world's academic economists in terms of citation and research. He is regularly published in Financial Times, Syndicate, Project Syndicate, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, Business Standard, and Indian Express. And he is authored more than 6 books. And I must say, this is only a very brief introduction about him. He's a person of immense standing in society, and is a really down-to-earth person. And I thank you so much, Arvind Subramaniam sir, for accepting our invitation, especially in these sort of times where there's so much unprecedented times, there's so much uncertainty. Even as persons who are little familiar with the economy as chartered accountants, even we can say that we are uncertain about the future. So having you here with us, addressing our members, sharing your insights and your experiences is definitely going to add a lot of value about how we talk to our clients as well. So thank you so much, sir, for taking time out of your busy schedule, joining live from the US, I must add, a very wee hours in the morning over there. So thank you, sir. We're looking forward to your address today. We welcome you.
First of all, thank you very much. It's not at all early in the morning. Like good South Indians, it's 8 o'clock in the morning, so I should have been up for at least 4 hours, drinking my coffee, having had 2 cups of coffee already. So please don't sympathize at all with it's quite late by Tamilian standards. First of all, I want to thank all of you at SIRC, Dr. Jain, Mr. Srinivasan, Mr. Murli, Honorable Chairman, and of course, most profusely, I want to thank first Mani Shankar Aiyer for inviting me to deliver this talk, and of course his daughter Yamini. Thank you all for inviting me. I think we should begin this appropriately first. At least I want to by, wishing Mani and his wife Sunit's really speedy recovery from their illness. I think that's the most important thing, that we really need them back bouncing and being their wonderful bubbly selves that they are, contributing so much to society and the country, and the family, of course. It's a great honor to deliver this lecture for a number of reasons. First and foremost, of course, because it is in honor of such an illustrious person. I mean, to be honest, I didn't know him or even know about him very much until I was asked to, speak in his honor here today. But you can see just from the way Yamini spoke about her grandfather, and the contributions as an individual, as a citizen of India, the institutions that he created, just the fact that people live in the minds of so many people, family and others, long after they have departed, shows you what an amazing man he must have been, quite apart from the lasting legacies that he's left, both in the profession, the chartered accountant profession, in other walks of life, in Chennai, in Delhi, all the institutions that he created, and all his things that Yamini so movingly spoke about. So that's why it's a real honor to deliver this lecture. As I said, I didn't know, I haven't known much about him, but you can infer a lot about a person from his children and kind of the next few generations. I certainly know two members of the next generation, Mani Shankar Aiyer and Swaminathan Aiyer, who are, amazingly illustrious. And then I know at least two more people, in the third generation, which is Yamini and Shekhar, who lives in Washington, D.C. And, this is not the time to go into this, but I think we should note, Yamini carrying on in the tradition of her grandfather, building this amazing institution, writing now so prolifically and so thoughtfully about developments in India. So, not just Mr. Shankar Aiyer himself, but the next 2, 3, and I have no doubt that legacy will continue. So it's a great honor for that reason as well. Of course, I'm a little bit nervous also addressing all of you, because certainly when I grew up, when we had to make some professional choices, they said, only the smartest people go and become CAs. The rest kind of do, riff-raff things like whatever, go to college. And since I wasn't a CA, I'm totally in awe of all of you and, the profession that you represent and all the good work that you're doing in terms of maintaining, standards of corporate governance in India have slipped. I think, the CA and the auditing profession have also come in for their share of criticism. But just to hear what, V. Shankar Aiyer and company stands for and represents is really quite wonderful. I'm also a bit nervous before I begin because, with this Shankar Aiyer family, they're ideologically so diverse that no matter what you say, you're going to antagonize one side or the other. I think it's fair to say that between Mani Shankar Aiyer and Swaminathan Aiyer, they kind of straddle the ideological spectrum. So I know at the end of the talk today, I'm going to be in someone's bad books. I don't know whether to be in only one person's bad books or both their bad books as a sign of, being whatever. So let me So with trepidation, let me kind of embark on this. And of course, listening to Yamini, it seems like also on the religious spectrum, they seem to be so far apart. There are confirmed atheists, they're confirmed believers, wonderful. And of course, last but not least, I think at this moment in time, it's a great honor to be here also because, the SANKAR AIYAR family really is a kind of cross-section of India itself and what it means to be a kind of Indian over and above all our narrow loyalties, straddling Lahore, Delhi, Chennai, temples, institutions. So, this is the idea of India that we all, embrace and want to nourish and nurture. And so, with those words, can I move on to the lecture itself with your permission? Yeah. Let me just say that this is I'm also thrilled because it's giving me a chance to, probably publicly for the first time, speak about this research, which I've done with a colleague and friend, actually also a fellow of Yamini's Center for Policy Research, Soumitra Chatterjee. So it's research done with a brilliant young professor, which I want to share. And to me, the topic is, as all of you said, very, very timely and important, because I think if we just step back and look at the global context, what we see around the world in the last few years is really toxic cocktail of political nationalism, which leads to and reflects economic nationalism. So this vicious combination of political and economic nationalism is really rampant in the world today. We see it in China, we see it in the United States, we see it in terms of the conflicts between countries. I just want to, we see it in terms of the US-China conflict. We see it in what the United Kingdom did withdrawing from the European Union, and of course for the last many years the world has more broadly seen the phenomenon of deglobalization, which after COVID it seems to be the case that these forces of political and economic nationalism in some ways are going to be reinforced, because people are going to say, we have to become more self-sufficient, we have to build our own supply chain. In fact, only 2 or 3 days ago, President Xi Jinping of China has kind of come out with this assertion that they need to be much more self-reliant as well. So all these trends, I think, augur very ominously for the world. And so if you just look at that and say, all this is happening around the world, why should we expect India to be any different? Because remember, over the last 60, 70 years, India has, embraced outward orientation, but always uneasily and not with great conviction. It's kind of been much more expedient. So India, in that sense, is pretty much in line with what is happening around the world. And just one thought for the moment. We've all woken up. We still don't know what the election result in the United States is going to be. But we are, I think the general consensus is that, the election only has, if anything, reinforced and aggravated the sense of polarization within India, within the United States, which means that all that we're going to speak about, the political nationalism and the economic nationalism, this is not going to go away after the election. If anything, it might even be reinforced. So it's kind of a somber morning that we all wake up to, even in terms of this topic of self-reliance and inwardness that we are going to be talking about. But my punchline is, I would really urge that India should resist succumbing to this siren song of self-reliance, or Atmanirbharta. Maybe I'll come back to this in the end, but let me quickly jump and this should also be in the first slide. I want to urge all of us to think in terms of this self-confidence, not self-reliance, and a self-confidence based on openness, as this wonderful quote by Mahatma Gandhi. Of course, he was saying this about a culture and civilization more broadly, but I think it also applies to the economic and trade sphere, the globalization sphere, where he says we should not be walled in. Our windows should be open, and the wind should blow about as freely as possible. But we should have the confidence, the self-confidence to realize that we're not going to be blown away. And so self-confidence, not self-reliance, and a self-confidence based on openness and competing internationally is what is going to be my punchline, my takeaway that I would like all of you to have from this scene. So having spoken about that, let me give you a sense of the guide map to the rest of the talk. I'm going to be focusing on what are the facts, why is it happening, will it succeed, and I want to conclude with some final reflections on Atmanirbharta and the risks and possible benefits of that. Just some definitions. I think that I don't want to be too technical, but I think when we think about Atmanirbharta, I think there are two kind of distinct dimensions to this. On the one hand, there are people who say, let our growth going forward now be based on domestic demand, domestic consumption, domestic investment, domestic government spending. And by the way, this is, to be fair, what I'm going to say is not necessarily just speaks to what the government is doing, but I think it speaks to a broader intellectual, consensus, a broader intellectual sense and a policy sense in India. For example, this macroeconomic thing that domestic demand, domestic consumption is shared very widely in India, and it's as much against that I would like to question that as much as anything else. So that's kind of the macro dimension, which says consumption, investment, government spending. Then of course there's the trade side, which is what we've seen is India has started to raise barriers to reduce foreign competition and encourage domestic production. So Atmanirbharta has two dimensions, domestic demand and on the trade side to raise barriers so that we have less foreign competition to encourage domestic production, which is kind of what Make in India and self-reliance are ultimately directed at. So let me begin with the facts. I think that I've already mentioned on the macro side, it's become like in India, it's like you read anything, you only read demand, consumption, demand, consumption. So that's kind of become very obvious. It's on the trade side that you see that policy has also changed quite a bit. And you have to think of this, what has happened in terms of reversing since 1991, as I said, somewhat reluctantly, somewhat expediently, but there was a real change in the consensus towards steady, gradual opening up of the economy. Trade barriers came down. We opened ourselves to foreign direct investment, to foreign technology, and so on. But since about 2014, as this chart shows, our tariffs have been increased substantially by about 5 percentage points. It affects about 300 billion of our imports, about 70%. So on the trade side, we can see clearly a reversal of a 3-decade-old consensus. And of course, other manifestations are, before 2014, we signed a lot of free trade agreements, especially with our East Asian partners. Now all that's been put on hold. there was a lot of talk of signing a free trade agreement with the European Union. That's been put on hold. We also now see a lot of production incentives being given to companies to attract them to manufacture in India. That's also a kind of inward orientation, because we're giving subsidies for domestic production. And of course, this is something I don't want to get into, because the motivations are completely different. There are a whole bunch of China motivated restrictions, but that because the rationale and the causes for this are different, I'm not going to be talking about that. But of course, it's consistent with this overall trend of raising barriers, reducing competition, emphasizing domestic production, domestic demand. That's kind of the broader sense of Atmanirbharta that I sense happening in India for the last, especially in the last 2 or 3 years, but probably began even before. And as I said earlier, this is not out of line with what is happening globally. Now, the question is, why is this happening in India? We know why it's happening internationally. I think there are some three India-specific reasons, which I think we should take very seriously. I mean, I think, to be fair to those who think about Atmanirbharta and things, it's not as if it doesn't have a rationale. In fact, if you look at this week's Economist, there's a piece on, today, on why the old import substitution strategy that India and a number of developing countries abandoned, why it's kind of coming back in fashion. So there is that general trend, but I think there is a kind of India-specific, there are a set of India-specific reasons why this is happening as well. I think there's a very strong sense that India is a big market. So unlike in the past, people think, oh, so what if we can't export? Our market is big. It's big enough to sustain, growth after the COVID crisis. The second reason is that I think there is a general sense that, India has always been a domestic demand-based model of growth, and India therefore has never really exported, and so why should it be able to export going forward? And the third reason, also very, I think, legitimate, is there is the sense that because the world is deglobalizing, even if India wanted to, the sense is that our export opportunities are going to shrink because, every country is raising tariff barriers, and so our opportunities are going to shrink. Even China is raising barriers, and so even if we wanted to export, we won't be able to export. So, but I'm going to try and persuade you over the next 20-25 minutes that each of these is actually misconceived, almost like a myth. India's market is not big. We are have been an export-led model of growth, and there will be export opportunities even if the world is deglobalizing. So let me take up each of these in turn. So when people think about India now, especially within India, they say, wow, Facebook, 400 million users, telecom, 1 billion cell phones, and all these hundreds of millions, billions numbers that keep getting thrown around gives a sense that India is actually a very big country, a big market. And and to be fair, India's GDP is about 2.9 trillion. This is just before COVID. Of course, it's come down after COVID by about 10%. But just even focusing before COVID, the sense is fifth largest economy in the world, 1.3 billion consumers. This is a big market. But what we try and show is that this is actually a kind of delusion that we have, that India is a big market. It turns out that if you think of a market as people having some purchasing power over kind of middle class goods and services, fridges, TVs, cars, shirts, phones, services. If you focus on how much real purchasing power there is in India, and we've done some rough estimates, it turns out that India's actually market size is not very big. And there are two reasons for this. One is that, whatever cutoff you take and say, below this people won't have much purchasing power, above this they will. It turns out that India has a lot of people with limited purchasing power. 30, 40, 50% of India has, well below what we would call a middle class income. So they don't have very much purchasing power. So, and on the other hand, there are a few people, maybe the top 10, 20% of the population with a lot of purchasing power, but they also tend, with a lot of income, but they also tend to save a lot and consume very little. So if you put together these two facts, a lot of poor people who don't consume very much, at least don't buy the kind of goods and services that we want them to, and a few people who have a lot of money but who actually save 50%, you end up with this, slightly striking finding that India's purchasing power, really is about 30-40% of your headline GDP number. So we estimate that India's real effective middle class purchasing power, fraction of our GDP, much less than China's, and above all, about 1-2% of the potential global market that we should in fact be setting our sights on. So if you look at this table on the right, you see that India's effective purchasing power, maybe somewhere between half and 1.5 trillion. China's 6-7 times that, and the world about 50-60 times that. So the notion that we are a big market is simply not true, and therefore we should be very careful about saying, oh, the Indian market can sustain long-run growth for a very rapid and long-run rates of growth. So that's a bit of a myth. So let's not succumb to that delusion. The second, I think, myth is that India cannot be a real exporting powerhouse. And this, for us, was the really most striking and new finding. When we discovered this, kind of our jaws dropped and our eyes popped out like a wow moment. Whenever you do research, you say, wow, I did really, and I've been in government, I've been studying India for at least 10 to 20 years, and when we had this finding, which is like really a moment of epiphany for us. And the finding is that we know that India has been a very rapid and a very successful exporter of services. I'm sure V. SANKAR AIYAR and company, if it wanted, it could set up offices all over the world, and that you probably also already export your services all over the world. We know that. But what was the striking finding is that in the last 30 years, since about 1991, India has been the world's third fastest grower in terms of manufacturing exports. And our finding is that, for 30 years, every year in dollar terms, India has been growing at 12%, and that's been second only to Vietnam and China. So the notion that India was this very uncompetitive, ponderous, inefficient economy, the truth is that India was like an East Asian tiger over the last 3 decades. So not only can India, India can be an exporter, it has been an amazingly successful exporter in manufacturing, and we estimate roughly that exports have contributed about 1/3 to overall growth. So in the 90s, exports grew rapidly, India's GDP grew rapidly. In the 2000s, exports grew rapidly, very rapidly, and our growth just took off. And in the 2010s, our exports slowed down, and so did our overall economic activity. So that our exports have been amazingly done well, and they have contributed a lot to our overall economic dynamism. So we should not think that India cannot be an exporter. It already has been, and it's been like an East Asian tiger. The myth number 3, which I think also we have to take very seriously, is that the future will be very different. So it is true that after 2010, the world economy has been deglobalizing. The blue line that you see, it peaked in about 2010. This is world exports of goods, the blue line. After 2010, it's declined, fairly substantially, and that's the sense in which the world has been deglobalizing. But what people haven't recognized is that despite this, if you look at the red line, global trade in services has actually been rising. So services trade, and as you know, India has a comparative advantage in services exports. So this opportunity is not going to go away. You know, especially in terms of IT, financial services, accounting services, India's prospects on services are actually not bad at all. I would go further and say that after COVID, one, I think probably semi-permanent impact of COVID is going to be that all those activities that have been done closer together, like restaurants, entertainment, music events, big gatherings, those I think are to be probably adversely affected. But those activities that can be done at a distance, without close physical contact, those are going to actually benefit, and those are exactly these services in which India has a comparative advantage. So even if you think that in goods our opportunities are going to shrink, I think one should probably be confident and optimistic that in services where India has a comparative advantage, these opportunities are going to increase. The second reason why we should not buy into the future will be different is a little bit of a paradox. If you think about it, in manufacturing, India is actually a small exporter, not a big exporter, i.e. our global market share in manufacturing is about 1.7%, which is even less than Vietnam's. Now, why is this important? It's important because if you're currently small, then you can afford to grow very rapidly and still not, kind of threaten, governments around the world. So China now, for example, cannot grow very big because people have said we're not going to, enough of getting goods from China. They've become too big, so we have to, take action against them. India is still very small, that it's still not going to threaten, any market, any government, any constituency else around the world. And so, being small, it's kind of an advantage of past underperformance, that there is scope to grow in the future without threatening the world. So even if the world, another way of putting it is to say that even if the world deglobalizes in goods, we can grow by gaining market share at the expense of other countries. And so all it requires us to be competitive. We don't have to worry about that much about the fact that the underlying global opportunities themselves are shrinking. And if you look at, in fact, the period after 2010, this is exactly what India was doing. The world economy was slowing down very rapidly, but Indian exports actually did better than world exports, and we were gaining market share. So even if the world deglobalizes, because we are small, as long as we can be competitive, we can gain global market share. So that's another reason why we should not buy into the pessimism about the future. Now, the last and most, I would say, most important reason why we shouldn't buy into the pessimism is that we still have a big opportunity in low-skilled export performance. Now, this chart on the right is a bit complicated. I'm not going to explain it, but essentially, the one way to think about this is that, look, India has a certain labor force, unskilled labor force. So our global share of unskilled labor exports should be roughly close to our, the unskilled labor itself. It turns out that we are massively underperforming. Our share of global labor is about 22%. But our share of global exports is only about 5 or 6%. So we calculate that India is under-exporting low-skilled goods by about $60 to $140 billion per year. And you will see that China is the exact opposite. That, having about 22 similar share of the global workforce, it's exporting almost 40%. Its share of global exports is 40%. So essentially, going forward, those two, China's has to come down, India's has to go up, and we need to do much more low-skilled exports. And that's another, and provided we can do that, the fact that the global economy could be shrinking shouldn't affect us so badly. So just to recap here, the three myths: India is not big, India has been a very successful exporter, and opportunities going forward are not going to shrink for India for these three reasons that I mentioned. So what about the prescriptions? I want to come back to this notion of growth based on domestic demand. One of the subjects I've studied a lot in the last 5-10 years is to study growth around the world, growth and globalization around the world. And I want to say it in I want to be very, very categorical here in terms of what the global evidence is. Nowhere in the world, at no point in time, has any developing country grown rapidly and sustainably, rapidly meaning over 6%, based on domestic demand alone. It hasn't happened. That model simply does not exist. So if you say let's grow based on domestic demand, it's almost a resignation of condemning ourselves to relatively low growth, because that model doesn't exist anywhere in the world. If you take Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, and above all China, they have grown at 10 to 15% exports to sustain their 7-8% rates of economic growth. So the model of rapid growth based on domestic demand doesn't exist. And that's been true for India as well. Before 91, our exports grew at about 4.5%. Our GDP grew at 3.5%. After 91, export growth 10%. Our GDP more than almost doubled to about 6.5%. So that's just something we need to keep in mind at the back of our mind. Neither the Indian experience nor the international experience has given us rapid rates of growth based on domestic demand. Now we come to the current context in terms of COVID. So supposing I were to grant you, okay, let's grow based on domestic demand. You say, okay, where is it going to come from? Households, but their incomes have collapsed. Their balance sheets are very weak. You say investment, private sector balance sheets are weak, and the banking system is completely short, saddled with NPAs, unable to lend. So credit growth to sustain investment is going to be very, very difficult going forward. And as we know, because of COVID, but even before, deficits and debts are now in India are going to shoot up in ways that maybe the government can support a post-COVID recovery, but it cannot be the basis for long-run growth because our debt to GDP is going to be close to 90 to 100% of GDP over the next 2 years. So even if you wanted domestic demand-based growth, the underlying balance sheets to support that are too weak to serve. They're all weak and bleeding. So it's almost as if India has no choice but to rely on export-led growth because domestic demand. So we have the curious irony that not only is domestic demand growth not going to give you 6% growth as the international experience and the Indian experience has shown, it's also not feasible to get domestic demand-based growth given the state of the private sector, the household sector, and the government sector going forward. So it's going to be very difficult. And the other last point I would say is that, so if you agree that exports are important, then you get the second corollary that exporting a lot requires importing a lot. And this is just another fact of the world. If you take clothing, for example, where we are underperforming relative to China, Bangladesh, Vietnam, the man-made fiber-based exports is the fastest growing sector in the world. Now take this sector. What you find in China and Vietnam, that every dollar of exports has 45% or 45 cents of imports. So to export a lot, you have to import the yarn and the brick. And China imports 45% for every 1 unit of exports. India 16%. So, so if you want to ramp up your exports, and that 16% is part of the reason why we're not exporting a lot, because we're not importing enough. And, I want to show you this chart. This is man-made yarn. This is the input that goes into the fastest growing segment, man-made fiber exports. India's tariffs are not only amongst the highest in the world. In 2018, they were increased, they were doubled to make, yarn has gone up, so that importing to export will become more difficult, and therefore exporting will be affected even much more. So taking stock, the prescription of Atmanirbharta, export growth is the only way forward, and in current circumstances you can't even get demand-based growth, and if you want to export a lot, you have to import a lot. That's just a fact of life, and that's why Atmanirbharta is going to be a difficult proposition in terms of sustaining growth in the post-COVID world. Now, so I want to just conclude with some broader reflections. To me, when suddenly India turns inward, or gradually it's been turning inward, it kind of prompts the famous question, if it ain't broke, why fix it? Because, as I showed you, exports have been, the basis of India's rapid growth. If it's been a kind of golden goose for India, why should we kill it? It seems a little bit odd to do so. I think the other thing to recognize about this whole outward orientation is that, look, I think if we are competitive globally, we are competitive locally. But the reverse is not true. If you're competitive locally, there's no guarantee that you're going to be competitive globally. So there is a big asymmetry between outward orientation and inward orientation. Inward orientation, yes, maybe you can get the domestic market, but as I showed you, nowhere in the world has there been a basis for long-run growth, and there's no guarantee. In fact, many would argue, the trade theorists would argue, that inward orientation actually is going to, almost built in to make you less competitive internationally, because you're protected, less competition, and therefore less able to compete internationally. And the other thing to remember about outward orientation is that the global market is always going to be bigger than the domestic market. So the real two advantages of outward orientation, that by definition the market is bigger, and by definition, if you're competitive internationally, you're competitive locally. So that's kind of the deeper reason why outward orientation is very important. Now, I don't want to be unfair to the evidence. It is true that a lot of East Asian countries, in the 60s and 70s, they managed to export a lot, even though the government intervened heavily with subsidies like India is doing today. So in principle, it's possible that you give subsidies, you give a bit of protection, and then force companies to remain competitive, and discipline them into exporting a lot. So that model is possible, but I think I would be very reluctant to adopt that for India, because what the East Asian countries were able to do was the government was able to force their companies to export and impose that discipline in very credible ways, in a manner that I don't feel the Indian state will be able to do. So that's why I think you can export by intervening a lot. That model is possible. That's not something that I would be confident recommending for India. I think this big prize that we spoke about, this unskilled labor exports that India should grab, I think can go into what are the many small things that we need to do, but I think there are some big things that need to accompany if we are to grab this prize of this unskilled exports, like textiles, clothing, leather, footwear, ceramics, toys, all of these things that China and the East Asians have done so well. I think the first is this mindset of export. We should become obsessed with exporting as a nation. And all the the sentiments in India are going in the opposite direction, saying, oh, we're a big market, we're a big market. And so if you get into this complacency that we're a big market, I think this obsession of exporting will go. And I think we need that export obsession to be able to grab the prices. So that's one, I think, a takeaway. The other is that if someone were to come and ask me or ask anyone, how do we grab this prize? I think there are no easy answers. I think, remember, this is also an indictment of 70 years of poor development performance. We're under-exporting, underperforming in unskilled labor, not because of anything that's happened just in the last 4 or 5 years. It's something that we haven't been able to do for 45, 50 years. So it's kind of much more deep-seated problem in India. And in order to do that, I think government, capital, and labor have to come together, and every party has to be assured that it will be rewarded and not be penalized. Because frankly, to become a global export player in clothing, our labor laws talk about 50 and 100 and 300. This is completely neither here nor there, and they're all kind of almost irrelevant. If you want to be competitive on this, your factory size has to be 30,000, 40,000, 50,000, not 300 and 400 and 500. Now, we've never really done that. In some services we have, but that's been a different context. If you want to replicate this in low-skill manufacturing, it's not going to be easy, and it will really require a kind of tripartite, government, capital, and labor coming together. Achieving scale, setting ambitious targets, and really obsessing about exports. I also want to warn about the subtle dangers of this Atmanirbharta. What it is also feeding is the sense that, especially in the technology sectors, we should create national champions. And here, all of us are, want to imitate China. China has all these amazing technology firms in financial technology, all these other things, and they're all kind of national champions supported by the government in various ways. So the question is, if China can do it, why can't we do it? Why can't we have big tech, Amazon-like companies, big Facebook-like companies, big telecom-like companies, and make them national champions, support them, help them, so that they can do as well as the Chinese companies. I think there's a real danger here, because I think political and economic nationalism can be a toxic cocktail. And if domestic institutions are not robust, there's a real danger that these national champions can they can start stifling competition, they can become too powerful, their tentacles can spread very widely. And so this would be to the long run detriment of both Indian economics and probably Indian politics as well. So I think we should be very careful about allowing this Atmanirbharta to in any way validate or legitimize the creation of a few big national champions. Yes, there are advantages to being big in the technology sector. Yes, there are economies of scale. Yes, by having networks, you can exploit these things. But we mustn't forget that finally all these benefits accrue only if there is the possibility of competition. Amazon finally, whether we look at Microsoft in the past or Apple or Amazon, they always have to be on their toes because there's going to be competition. But if the Indian state prevents that competition and just favors a few national champions, then it's going to be, we risk creating these domestic monopolies and oligopolies, which I think can be quite detrimental to our long-run interests. So this is not something that we speak about in the paper, but I think it's something that's useful to keep in mind, that there are other subtler dangers with an ideology of economic nationalism, especially if it's going to promote national champions. I've taken up too much of your time. I do want to come back and say our motto should be, as Mahatma Gandhi said in another context, a self-confidence based on openness, on competition, on allowing, as he says, the culture of all lands to be blown, the competition from all lands to be blown, but doing the hard work to show that we can compete internationally. That is the best way out of the COVID crisis. That is the best way India can restore, 6, 7, 8% rates of growth that are absolutely essential to, improving lives, livelihoods, employment opportunities, reducing poverty, reducing stress for India. I think unless we regain that dynamism with this confidence and outward orientation, I think we're going to make the future task for ourselves much more difficult. And I think no one said it better than the father of our nation, Mahatma Gandhi. So let me stop there and take questions.
Yeah, I'll just put the questions on the screen as well, sir, so that it will be easy for you to. Abhishek, is the screen visible, Abhishek?
Yeah, it's visible. So do you want me to just look at the questions and answer them, or?
Whichever way, I think that will be fine, sir, if you can do that.
Would it be easier, Arvind, if we just sort of picked up a cluster of them and posed them to you?
Yeah, I mean, that's much better. Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Oh, sure. So, okay, can you just give me, somebody will scroll through because I don't have access to scrolling. So I think the first question is really about whether, how do we think about in the current moment, whether we should be pursuing a Keynesian path of government spending to spur demand versus alternative options. How can we spur the economy through tax cuts that could then create more circulation of money, leading to greater consumption? So really, should we be looking at more government investment in infrastructure and other forms of spurring demand, or are there other ways in which one can look for policy options that could address the demand crisis that we face?
See, I think we should distinguish between what we need to do to get out of the COVID, kind of the recovery phase, and the more medium-term phase. I think these are two distinct kinds of time perspectives on the question. I think there is no doubt that in the short run, if you see even the headline number that India's growth of -10% for this year is going to be amongst the most adverse in the world. And part of the reason for that, there are many reasons. Part of the reasons for that is that the Indian fiscal response has been much less than in most other countries. The IMF has calculated that India has spent about 2% of GDP, whereas many countries around the world have spent 8, 9, 10% of GDP. So there is no doubt that in the short run, the government needs to probably spend much more, some of it on social insurance, social protection, cash transfers, all of that. I think that's very important in the short run. But the real question that I'm trying to address here, Shobitra and I, is much more to do with, beyond. Let's say, recovery is 2020, 2021. What is the basis for going back to 7, 8% growth like we did for 25 years? That's, I think, the big question. And there, can we do this just based on government spending? I think I don't see that. partly because I think there will be, once you run up debts of about, 100% of GDP, there's always going to be, with one eye, we always have to go look at, inflation, sustainability and all of that. And frankly, having been in government, it's not as if, there are all these, investment projects out there that are just waiting to be spent. I think, we have discovered that spending by government, especially with all this 4C problem, is not going to be that easy. So yes, there is some scope for the government to do more. But again, nowhere in the world has government spending sustained growth over 25, 30 periods of time. In most countries around the world, the East Asians, sustained growth has been possible through investment and exports. Those have been the big engines of growth, and that's what we need to re-stimulate. Now, for investment, I think that this is something that I would like to stress that all of you should really be thinking about. Is, in the last, since about 2011-12, part of the reason why our economy has been slow is that credit growth has basically collapsed, especially to industry. We call this the twin balance sheet problem, because after the boom of the 2000s, what we found was that, infrastructure companies had borrowed too much and banks had lent too much. But over the last 4 or 5 years, we know that disease of the financial sector spread. It spread to non-infrastructure companies, to real estate companies, to manufacturing companies, and it also spread to NBFCs and other financial firms. So unless we revive our financial system, which, by the way, no matter what people say, after the COVID crisis, the financial system is going to be much weaker by definition, because if you take a hit of 10% of GDP growth, more and more people are not going to be able to repay their borrowing, whether it's households, firms. So we're going to emerge from COVID with non-performing assets in the banking system that are going to be very, very high. 20% is not an unreasonable number. So unless, because no economy can survive in the long run without credit, and you can't get credit if the financial system is, and that's why in the last 10 years, credit growth has been very weak, and so private investment has been non-existent, for about ever since the global financial crisis. So I think a combination of export-led growth and cleaning up the financial system with some support from government, spending, investment, there are new ideas that we need to consider in terms of, making the social safety net much more comprehensive, much fewer leakages, and CPR and Yamini have done a lot of excellent work on this. So there is a kind of social spending, social safety net component to this, but that is not a substitute or cannot be the only basis for sustaining long-run growth.
Thank you. The next question is really more linked to, I think, the last point you made about creating national champions. And it's sort of, if we don't have our own Facebook, Zooms, or Googles, really, what is our export comparative advantage?
See, remember one thing with, I think we need to be first of all clear about this, that all the talk about national champions in India is still based on thinking India is a big market. I don't think we have given serious thought to whether these national champions will also be international champions. The thing about these Chinese companies is that they're turning out to be international champions, and so I think we need to keep that in mind, that if you're going to create national champions for the national market, then maybe it will work, maybe whatever, but you're certainly not going to get the international market, so it's not going to be an international champion. So then you run into the same problem of, can this sustain growth, given that the national market is going to be small. I think the second real danger here is that, if national champions become too big relative to the state, we're also going to get, a regulatory capture. We're going to get, policies being done to stifle competition, and that can't be. See, as I said, in the United States, Google and Amazon, they're always under threat of being challenged. But if we don't have that possibility within India, you're not going to get, the forces of competition. So at the end of the day, yes, there may be a logic for having, at least where it's kind of security related, or even, in terms of data, maybe a little bit more localization, a little bit more, for the Indian market, not so reliant on the Facebooks of the world. But there is that other side, that it needs to be balanced with things which, if India doesn't have in terms of robust institutions, we need to be very, very careful and wary going forward.
Great. So the next two questions, I'm going to try and bridge them together. One is really about, how do we build our, at least my interpretation of what the question is really about how do we build our own export competitiveness, given that input costs are very high, and our markets are large enough for the world to want to come we are importing a large number of goods more than services. So there is a question of the domestic market itself, and related to that is a sense that eventually India may end up becoming an importer of services. Then what? So I think really the question is, there are high input costs that make manufacturing difficult for India. Will we really be able to be genuinely competitive? And over time, there is a possibility that India may emerge as an importer of services, because being an exporter is not sustainable in the long term.
That means basically we're doomed. if that's the prognosis.
But I think there is a question here, just in terms of what do we need to do to be able to be genuinely competitive on manufacturing, which has always been the big Achilles heel.
Yeah. See, so one thing is that I think we need to study much more why we've been so successful in, other manufacturing. So that's one of the, the real surprises here. We've been quite successful in relatively high skill manufacturing. And so that's some lesson we need to learn from that. Maybe, pharmaceuticals, things like that we can, especially with the opportunities opening up. See, on the unskilled, I think, which has been a real bane of India for the last 75 years. I think, as I said, input costs are very high. I think that, all the problems of land allocation, getting things done on time, an easy tax system. So really, I think that we need to be on kind of mission mode. It's like, we send people to Mars, the Chandrayaan mission. I think that should be the, unskilled labor export mission, because there's no one agency or one action that we can do to do this. I genuinely also think that this is a place where, state governments and central governments need to come together. So to give you one example, right? Foxconn maybe wants to come to India. I think they've already set up a plant in Andhra Pradesh employing about 20,000 people, let's say. Those are the kinds of models that every state should be trying to replicate, with the help of the central government and with the help of labor and capital. You see, there's a funny thing that's happened in India over the last several decades, that in some ways India penalizes both capital and labor, and it kind of favors capital and labor as well. So all these things are going on. It penalizes capital because at the drop of a hat, something happens, we don't worry about expropriating in some form or the other. On the other hand, we also give them all these sweetheart deals, etc. Similarly with labor, on the one hand, we don't really give them opportunities for becoming big, and yet we have laws that can penalize becoming very big. So I think it's really a jumble of laws and regulations. But here's a very important point to understand, that so supposing we ask an investor to come and say, build a plant with 50,000 people. I think what is important is this: given our history, if something starts going wrong in that plant, let's say something happens, if at the drop of a hat the government says, sorry, now you're on your own, then I think it's going to be very difficult to create the kind of confidence either for capital or for labor to buy into this. So it requires a long period of sustained engagement with capital and labor on the part of governments, central and state governments, to kind of do this. Coming to the other point that you mentioned, Yamini, I mean, I don't think, if India's market is, so let me give you some evidence on the experience of the cell phone, what's happened in the last 3-4 years on cell phones. It is true that all these incentives have led to increased production in India, mostly based on increased imports because input tariffs have been slashed, and there's also some evidence of exports having gone up. But it is too soon to declare this any kind of success, because A, it's related to the incentives. B, the exports are from very, very small base. So India still today in this global cell phone market is probably less than 1%. So if this experience of it's a kind of bait and switch that we think we can do. We bait them saying we have a big domestic market, but then we say no, you also have to export. That's kind of what some of the East Asians did. It's possible to do it. It's possible to do it, but I think it's that switch part of it. What are the incentives and the disciplines that we can get them to switch from just catering to the domestic market? We've not been that successful with that. People will argue that in the automotive parts sector, our phased manufacturing program was a bit of a success along those lines. You first come in, you localize, import, substitute, and then But then, for every successful automotive thing, there are also, 5-6 examples of, things where it didn't succeed. So maybe what we should be thinking about, drawing the lessons from the successful ones, and as well as the lessons from the unsuccessful ones. But I would still be nervous about saying, look, our market is big enough to attract people and then, make them export.
Thank you. Okay, I think you've actually answered a couple of the questions that are up here in the course of this. So maybe we can just scroll down a little bit. But as we are scrolling down, Arvind, we're keen to hear your reflections on where private capital or Indian entrepreneurs sit on this, because often a lot of the lobbying that comes, again, if you look at the many different stakeholders that push back on things like RCEP, Indian industry in different parts has sort of essentially said to government that we are not going to be able to compete if you open up, right? So they too have played an intriguing role in how India wants to position itself in terms of becoming part and parcel of, even within the region, these free trade agreements that would potentially help us along the way. So where do you see the role of Indian industry, Indian lobbying, our own internal sense of our competitiveness and our capabilities if we genuinely want to be open and export?
So that's a really good question. First, I think the experience shows, Yamini, that even in the post-global financial crisis phase, when the world economy slowed down, we actually gained market share. We also slowed down, but we slowed down much less, and we were actually gaining global market share. even in those times. I think what makes your question really salient and important is that I think this kind of underconfidence that Indian industry started acquiring, after the go-go years of the 1990s and 2000s, is that when the economy started slowing down and lots of excess capacity was built up, I think that phase of the slowdown is when Indian industry started becoming very, very anxious about protecting its market share. So some of it was due to a generalized sense that, oh my God, the world economy is slowing down, even our economy is slowing down, so the only way we can survive is by keeping out foreign competition. So I think that I think therefore standard kind of response in these situations is actually to get the kind of export interest into play as well. There's always going to be a strong import competing interest, but there is a big export interest. Our clothing, footwear, there are lots of exporters. I think we need to bring them into play and say, what kind of things would you need, and then work with them so that the political economy of what you're saying is partly overcome. So just to give you one example, it's a very concrete example. It happened, even when I was in government. In 2016, we did a big package for the clothing sector, if you remember. At that stage, the clothing sector, textiles, clothing, leather, footwear, they were actually quite, would have supported very strongly a free trade agreement with the European Union, because they were saying at that point, that will give us level the playing field for us as exporters vis-a-vis Bangladesh and Vietnam. Because Bangladesh gets zero tariff access into Europe, we get 10-15%. Similarly, now Vietnam has a free trade agreement. So they could have been harnessed. But what was kind of coming in the way, of course, was, the producers of cars said, no, but this means we'll have to open up our car market and get in European cars. But then I think that's where I think, the Indian state could say, look, this is, the export competing interest here is more important because it's highly labor intensive, highly woman labor intensive, as clothing employs 80% of women. So of course, there are going to be some costs on the other side, but on balance, it was like a no-brainer in terms of what the net balance of benefits could be. So I think those are the kinds of things that could make both Indian industry, export industry come on board, as well as harness their interest in outward orientation in a way that one can make this sustainable. So those were they were very keen on doing this European Union agreement. I can understand the reluctance vis-a-vis RCEP, because there is a sense in which RCEP means we're going to open ourselves up more to China. And I think that is understandable. But that's why I think we need to open up vis-a-vis countries with whom we are complementary rather than with whom we compete. Last point, I would say another reason, Yamini, to answer your question is that at least from 2014 onwards, our exchange rate started becoming very strong and uncompetitive. For about 20% real loss in competitiveness happened, which also I think undermined which created a import surge, because our export thing was becoming very strong. So I think we need to have a much more competitive exchange rate, and that's something that would be what government can contribute. When you come together, the government says we will help in whatever ways, but we'll also give you a kind of competitive exchange rate on this to ensure that this is this. So there's no one thing that I think can be done, but a lot of things coming together. But I think it's doable, and frankly, we have no other choice actually.
Yeah. How much? We're at 7:40. How much time do we have? Because there's a few questions I can club as a sort of last one, but I just wanted to ask the chairman, so Dr. Murli.
5 to 10 more minutes is pretty okay with.
Oh, Okay, so let me just try and there's a mischief question I'm going to ask you. What's your opinion on China scuttling and pursuing pruning its own entrepreneurs? Example, the IPO of Jack Ma. But more broadly, also to get your reflections on the sort of state-directed industrial policy, and we had taken industrial policy off the table in India back in the day. Do we need to bring that back from a different perspective?
See, I think the honest answer is we have brought it back via these production incentives and Make in India, all of this. Make in India, as on some interpretation, is a kind of industrial policy. Some protection, some subsidies, some tax breaks. So kind of the usual mixture of industrial policy. I think that we need to distinguish that from what China is doing. China is doing kind of a very unique model of state-led capitalism, but in the new and high-tech sectors. They're not doing, on the standard, exports of goods. It's kind of, standard outward orientation, and they're gaining market share and whatever. So what? And there was about 4 or 5 weeks ago, The Economist had a piece on China's state-led capitalism. But here's the thing. Here's what I think is very important. And all that I'm going to say now is I'm going to end with the whole Jack Ma and listing, which is that the amazing thing about this state-led capitalism that China was doing in the high-tech sector was that even though there was a lot of state intervention, support, sometimes even state-owned enterprises, somehow they have managed to see. The funny thing is they've kept up foreign competition. Google is banned, Facebook is banned. Foreign competition is banned in China, but domestic competition has been fierce and ferocious. You see even the churn in these big companies in China. So that's what is, I think, very, very really special. Of course, this whole what they've done with Ant kind of shows that ultimately there are going to be constraints to how much state-led capitalism you can do. That's something that we don't want to think about at this stage, because China has continuously defied us and said we say that economic openness and political closedness are not compatible, but China has shown it's compatible for 50, 60, 70 years. We think that state-led capitalism cannot be consistent with a thriving private sector, especially in these services sectors. It's doing that, but suddenly we wake up to the fact that hey, maybe there are limits to that, especially if in these high-tech sectors. And this is a point that Aditya Mattu of the World Bank makes, that in these high-tech sectors, capitalism and these whole the imperatives of the government, security, privacy, they are going to clash, and that's why the whole state-led capitalism model ultimately, is it going to be feasible? We're going to discover over the next 10, 15 years. But in the meantime, what is and this is why I think there's a distinction between the national champions approach in India and in China. Both want to block off foreign competition. Fine, that's a choice we make in these high-tech sectors. But how do you ensure at least ferocious domestic competition? In India, for me, the danger is that you're choking that off, which is, I think, that is not a recipe for, and that's not what China is doing.
Absolutely. I think thank you so much for so patiently answering these questions and deepening our understanding of your thesis. Really, really appreciate this. I'm going to now hand over back to Dr. Murli to take us through the last segment of the ceremonies.
Okay, ma'am. Over to the chairman.
Okay,
Yeah,
over to the chairman.
In fact, Arvind sir, excellent presentation. In fact, you have let us know of how things have been happening and how things should happen going forward. A lot of excellent perspective. Thank you so much for your time and an excellent intervention and deliberation with all of us. Abhishek, over to you for a well-deserved vote of thanks for the program.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Arvind sir. Really wonderful presentation. As always, very eloquent, articulate, and you went through the specifics. You know, we tend to talk a little bit at a bird's eye view, but you were able to give us the specific issues, the specific sort of threats which are there, and where we could potentially have opportunities as well. And thoroughly enjoyed your presentation. Thank you so much for your time, and being a very busy person such as yourself, it's a huge privilege for us to have you with us and address our members at this forum. I also want to thank Dr. Yamini ma'am, and when she was picking out her questions, I think we could tell her knowledge, depth of knowledge in the subject as well. So she was managing to pick out the right questions and, you know, ask the right questions to our speaker as well. So thank you so much, ma'am, and especially thanks for organizing this program with coordinating with your father as well. And we really wish both your parents a very speedy recovery and hope to see them join us soon next year when we have this lecture. I also want to thank CA Raja sir, who is also a very close friend of my father, I must add. Thank you so much for being part of this program today. And also, last but not least, I want to thank our chairman, CA Dungarchand Jain, who made this program happen. And with his support, it's a grand success. All the participants have attended in large numbers. We had almost 1,400 registrations for the program. And I think all the professionals who participated were very eagerly involved as well, asking a lot of questions, learning in the process. So I want to thank all the participants who have joined in so eagerly and, you know, made this a really interactive session. We feel really encouraged and motivated by the sort of feedback that you're sharing. So thank you all. Stay home, stay safe. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you everybody. Before we close, I will request everybody to raise for the national anthem. So let's play the national anthem, please.
It's almost over.
Thank you all of you. Thanks for your time and thanks for the support.
Thank you very much. Real privilege.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks
Bye.
a lot. Thanks, Arvind. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.